The letter arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning. At first, my mom thought it was just another HOA newsletter. She set it on the kitchen table next to her tea and didn't open it for hours. But when she finally did, everything changed. Because inside that envelope was a 7-day eviction notice. 7 days. For a 93-year-old woman who had lived in that house for over 40 years. My mother, Eleanor, wasn't the type of person who caused problems. She was quiet, friendly, the kind of neighbor who baked cookies for everyone during the holidays, the kind who watered plants for people when they went on vacation. And after my father passed away 10 years earlier, the house had become her whole world. Every room was filled with memories, photos, old furniture, little things that meant everything to her. So when she read the words, "vacate the property within 7 days," she honestly thought it had to be a mistake. The letter came from the HOA board. Apparently, they had recently updated their community compliance rules. One of the new regulations required all homes to maintain exterior standards that matched the neighborhood aesthetic. In simpler terms, they didn't like how my mom's house looked. Her home wasn't falling apart, it was just older. The paint was a little faded, the wooden porch railing needed replacing, and the flower beds hadn't been maintained as carefully since my father passed. But the house itself was perfectly safe, perfectly livable. Yet the HOA letter made it sound like it was some kind of eyesore. My mom called the number listed on the letter that afternoon. A woman answered. HOA Management Office. Yes, my mom said politely. I received a notice saying I have to leave my home in 7 days. There was a pause. Then the woman replied calmly, Yes, that's correct. My mom blinked. I think there's been some confusion. No confusion, ma'am. The board has determined your property is not compliant with neighborhood standards. But I've lived here since 1983. Those rules were updated this year. And you're asking me to move? 7 days, yes. My mom's voice trembled slightly. I'm 93 years old. The woman sounded completely unmoved. Well, the HOA guidelines apply to all residents equally. Then she added something that made my mother sit down slowly in her chair. If the home is not vacated, legal action may follow. My mom didn't cry right away. She just sat there quietly with the letter in her hand. Then she reached for the phone again. This time, she called me. I was thousands of miles away when the phone rang. My unit had just returned from training. When I saw my mom's name on the screen, I smiled. She usually only called to check in, but the moment I answered, I knew something was wrong. Her voice was shaking. Sweetheart, I think I'm losing my house. I felt something in my chest tighten instantly. What happened? She explained everything slowly. The letter, the 7-day deadline, the conversation with the HOA office. By the time she finished, the room around me had gone completely silent. A few of the guys nearby could tell something was wrong just by looking at my face. Mom, I said calmly, don't pack anything. But they said, I'll handle it. She hesitated. I don't want to cause trouble. I almost laughed. Mom, they already did. For the next few hours I made calls. I looked up the HOA bylaws, property records, local ordinances, and the more I read, the more ridiculous the situation looked, because the HOA technically could issue fines for exterior violations. But forcing someone to leave their home in 7 days? That wasn't normal, not even close. The next morning, I booked the earliest flight home. 24 hours later, I was standing in my mom's driveway. The same driveway where I used to play basketball as a kid. The same house where every Christmas morning had happened. And now, there was something new attached to the front door. A bright orange notice. I pulled the paper off the door and walked inside. My mom was sitting at the kitchen table. When she saw me, her eyes filled with relief. You didn't have to come all this way. I hugged her gently. Yes, I did. Then I placed the notice on the table. Let's go meet your HOA. 30 minutes later, we were standing in the HOA office. Behind the front desk sat the same woman who had answered my mom's phone call earlier. She looked up at us with mild annoyance. Yes? I placed the eviction notice on the counter. You sent this to my mother. She glanced at it. Yes. You gave her 7 days to leave her home. That's correct. I nodded slowly. Then I asked one simple question. Did anyone from the board actually visit the property? She frowned slightly. That's not necessary. Oh, it's about to be. Because what the HOA didn't realize yet was that their 7-day ultimatum had just brought someone home who was very good at solving problems, very persistent, and very difficult to intimidate. They thought they were dealing with a quiet elderly homeowner. Instead, they were about to deal with her son. And by the time the HOA board realized who they had picked a fight with, the situation was already starting to spiral out of their control. The woman at the HOA office clearly didn't expect me to stay. Most people who walked in with complaints were usually brushed off with paperwork and polite excuses, but I didn't leave. Instead, I asked a very simple question. When is the next HOA board meeting? She hesitated. That information is only for residents. My mother is a resident. Another pause. Thursday evening. Good, I said. We'll be there. Over the next 2 days, I stayed with my mom and took a closer look at the house. Yes, the paint was a little faded. Yes, the porch railing could use a repair. But nothing about the property justified forcing a 93-year-old woman out in 7 days. In fact, the more I looked around the neighborhood, the stranger the situation seemed. Because several other houses had similar issues. One home down the street had peeling paint, another had a broken fence, yet none of them had orange eviction notices on their doors, which meant one thing. My mom had been specifically targeted. Thursday evening arrived. The HOA board meeting was held inside the community clubhouse. When we walked in, about 15 residents were already sitting in folding chairs. At the front of the room sat the HOA board. 5 members total. But the one sitting in the center was clearly in charge. Her nameplate read, Linda Harper, HOA president. And judging by the confident way she looked at everyone in the room, she was used to getting her way. The meeting started normally enough. Budget updates, landscaping complaints, discussion about a new playground installation. But eventually the floor opened for resident concerns. That's when I stood up. My name is Daniel, I said calmly. And I'm here about the eviction notice sent to my mother. The room went quiet instantly. Linda glanced down at some papers. Yes, we're aware of that property. You gave her 7 days to leave her home. That property is currently violating community appearance standards. Which standards exactly? She slid a document across the table. Exterior paint deterioration, unsafe porch railing, unmaintained landscaping. I looked at the paper briefly, then back at her. So your solution was eviction? Linda folded her hands. The board determined the property required immediate compliance. Immediate meaning 7 days? That was the deadline provided. Someone in the audience whispered, "She's 93. Another voice added, "That seems a little extreme." Linda's expression tightened. Our community has standards. I nodded slowly. I respect standards. Then I asked another question. Did the board offer assistance? Silence. No extension? Silence again. No repair plan? Nothing. That's when something interesting happened. One of the other board members shifted uncomfortably in his chair. A middle-aged man wearing glasses. He cleared his throat. Actually, I did suggest a longer timeline. Linda shot him a sharp look, but the majority voted for immediate action. I leaned forward slightly. Why? Linda's eyes narrowed. Because the property has become an eyesore. I glanced around the room. Then I said something very quietly. My father built that porch himself. The room grew even more silent. And my mother has lived in that house for 40 years. For the first time, a few people in the audience looked uncomfortable. One elderly neighbor raised her hand. I walk past that house every day, she said. It looks fine to me. Another resident spoke up. Mine needs paint too. Nobody gave me an eviction notice. Now people were starting to whisper among themselves, and Linda could feel the room turning. She tapped her pen against the table. This discussion is getting off track. No, I replied calmly. This is exactly on track. Then I placed something on the table in front of the board. A stack of printed photographs. Each photo showed another home in the neighborhood. Peeling paint, damaged fences, overgrown yards. But none of those homes had received eviction notices. I had spent the previous day walking the entire neighborhood documenting everything. Linda flipped through the photos slowly. Her jaw tightened. Selective enforcement is illegal in many HOA agreements, I said quietly. Now the room was completely silent. Even the other board members were staring at Linda. She placed the photos down carefully. That's your opinion. No, I replied. That's property law. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then the man with glasses on the board leaned toward Linda and whispered something. Her face turned red. She clearly hadn't expected this conversation to go in this direction. Finally, she straightened up and said, "The board will review the situation." I nodded. That's a good idea. But before sitting down, I added one more sentence. And if the eviction notice isn't withdrawn by tomorrow morning. I paused for a moment. Then the next meeting we have won't be in this clubhouse. Linda frowned. What does that mean? It means we'll be having the conversation somewhere else. On the drive home, my mom looked worried. Did we make things worse? I smiled slightly. No. But she seemed angry? That's because she realized something. What? That the board just lost control of the situation? But what none of us knew yet was that Linda had already decided to escalate the conflict. Because later that night, another notice appeared on my mom's front door. And this one was even worse than the first. And when I read those words the next morning, I realized something important. The HOA president wasn't backing down, which meant the next move was mine. When I pulled the second notice off my mom's front door the next morning, I read it twice just to be sure. Final notice: property subject to HOA seizure for non-compliance. Seizure. Not a fine, not a repair request. They were threatening to take her home. My 93-year-old mother stood beside me on the porch, her hands shaking slightly. What does that mean? She asked quietly. I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket. It means the HOA president just made a very serious mistake. Most people think HOAs have unlimited power. They don't. They can issue fines. They can require certain maintenance standards. But actually taking someone's home is an entirely different legal territory, and it comes with a mountain of rules. Rules that Linda clearly hadn't bothered to check. That afternoon, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to a property attorney in town. The second was to the county housing office. By the time I finished explaining the situation, both of them had the exact same reaction. A long pause. Then the lawyer asked, "Did you say the homeowner is 93 years old?" "Yes." "And they gave her 7 days to leave?" "That's right." Another pause. Then he said something that made me smile. "Well, this is going to be interesting." 2 days later, we were back at the HOA clubhouse. But this time, the atmosphere was very different. Because I hadn't come alone. Sitting beside me was the attorney. Across the table were the 5 HOA board members. And in the audience behind us sat nearly 30 residents. Word had spread through the neighborhood. People wanted to see what was happening. Linda walked into the room looking confident. But the moment she noticed the attorney sitting next to me, that confidence cracked just a little. She sat down and cleared her throat. "This meeting will come to order." My attorney stood up before she could continue. "Before we begin," he said politely, "I'd like to address the eviction and property seizure notices sent to Mrs. Eleanor Carter." Linda folded her arms. "The board has already explained those actions." "Yes," the attorney replied, "and we've reviewed them carefully." He placed a document on the table. According to county housing regulations, an HOA cannot initiate property seizure without a minimum 90-day compliance period and a formal repair mediation offer. The room went silent. Linda frowned. Our bylaws allow enforcement. Yes, the attorney said calmly, but your bylaws do not override state law. One of the board members leaned forward nervously. What happens if those rules aren't followed? The attorney didn't hesitate. Then the HOA could face charges of harassment, discrimination, and unlawful property interference. A ripple of whispers spread through the audience. Linda's face had turned pale. That's ridiculous. Is it? My attorney replied. Then he slid another document across the table. This is a formal complaint filed with the County Housing Authority this morning. Another paper followed. And this is a request for investigation into selective enforcement within the HOA. Linda grabbed the papers quickly and scanned them. Her hands were shaking now. You're overreacting. At that moment, someone in the audience spoke up. No, she's not. Everyone turned. It was the elderly neighbor who had spoken at the last meeting. She's lived here longer than most of us, the woman said, pointing toward my mom. You can't throw her out over paint. Another resident stood up. My fence has been broken for 2 years. Nobody threatened to seize my house. Then another voice joined in. And my yard isn't exactly perfect either. Suddenly, half the room was talking. The board members looked panicked. They hadn't expected the residents to turn on them. Finally, the man with glasses from the board leaned toward Linda and whispered urgently. She shook her head. But he whispered again. This time she looked around the room and realized something. She had lost control. Linda stood up slowly. The board will reconsider the enforcement action. My attorney nodded. That would be wise. And the notices will be withdrawn immediately. Good. But before sitting down, Linda said something else. We still expect the property to meet community standards. That was fair, so I nodded. Give us 90 days. She hesitated, then finally said, approved. The meeting ended shortly after that. Residents gathered around my mom offering support. Several even volunteered to help repair the porch and repaint the house. One neighbor said something that made my mom laugh for the first time in days. Looks like the whole neighborhood just joined your renovation crew. Over the next few weeks, something amazing happened. Neighbors started showing up with tools. One man brought lumber for the porch railing. Another helped repaint the front of the house. Someone else cleaned up the flower beds. What would have cost thousands of dollars turned into a community project. 3 months later, the house looked better than it had in years. Fresh paint, new railing, bright flowers along the walkway. But the biggest change wasn't the house. It was the HOA board. Because shortly after the investigation began, Linda Harper quietly resigned as HOA president. The board replaced her with someone far more reasonable. One evening, my mom and I sat on the front porch watching the sunset, the same porch my father had built decades earlier. She smiled and said softly, "You didn't have to fight this hard for me." I leaned back in the chair. "Mom," I said, "you spent your whole life protecting me." I looked out across the quiet street. Now it's my turn. And that's the thing about bullies, whether they're on a playground or running an HOA. They usually assume the person they're targeting won't fight back, but sometimes they pick the wrong family. And when that happens, the whole neighborhood ends up learning a lesson. Subscribe my YouTube channel for more HOA interesting videos.